The ocean stretched endlessly beneath us, a mirror of blue glass that reflected nothing but emptiness. No ships, no smoke, no signs of the massive Japanese fleet that intelligence promised would be here. Just silence, broken only by the steady drone of my SBD Dauntless engine and the crackle of static in my headset. For a moment, I wondered if we'd been sent on a wild chase across the Pacific, burning precious fuel on another false alarm. Then I saw them. 4 gray shapes materialized through the morning haze like ghosts rising from the depths. Aircraft carriers, the most powerful striking force the Japanese Navy had ever assembled, spread across the ocean in perfect formation. My heart hammered against my ribs as I keyed the radio. Tally-ho! 4 carriers, bearing 270, distance 12 miles. What happened next would change the course of the Pacific War forever. But in that moment, all I could think about was the voice of my gunner, Seaman First Class Tommy Rodriguez, crackling through the intercom behind me. Holy Mary, Lieutenant. Look at all those ships. I'm Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes, and I was there on June 4, 1942, when 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers turned the tide of World War II in 6 minutes of fury over the waters of Midway. 3 days earlier, we'd received word that the Japanese were coming. Not just a raiding force or a reconnaissance mission, the entire combined fleet, led by Admiral Yamamoto himself. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Over 250 aircraft. The cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy, coming to finish what they'd started at Pearl Harbor. We knew because we'd cracked their codes. While they thought they were sailing into an ambush at Midway, we were the ones preparing the trap. Admiral Nimitz had positioned every available ship and plane in the path of the advancing Japanese fleet. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waited northeast of Midway like coiled springs. I'd been flying off the USS Enterprise since before the war started. My squadron, VB6, had been together through the early dark days when it seemed like Japan was unstoppable. We'd watched them sweep across the Pacific, taking Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. We'd seen what their Zeros could do to our planes and our boys. But we'd also learned their weaknesses. We'd grown stronger, smarter, deadlier. The night before the battle, I couldn't sleep. None of us could. We knew this was it, the moment that would decide whether America would spend the next decade fighting to reclaim the Pacific, or whether we'd break the back of Japanese naval aviation in a single decisive blow. Captain Murray, our air group commander, had been clear in his briefing. Gentlemen, tomorrow we hunt carriers. The Japanese think they're going to catch us napping at Midway. Instead, we're going to send them to the bottom of the Pacific. June 4th dawned clear and calm. Perfect flying weather. At 0600 hours, we launched our first search planes, spreading out in a fan across the northern approaches to Midway. I was in the ready room, going over my charts for the 3rd time, when the call came through the ship's intercom. Pilots, man your planes. This is not a drill. My hands were steady as I climbed into the cockpit of my Dauntless. I'd named her Carol N after my girlfriend back in San Diego, and she'd brought me through every mission so far. The SBD might not have been the fastest plane in the sky, but she was tough as nails and accurate as a rifle when you put her into a dive. Tommy Rodriguez was already in the rear gunner's seat, checking his twin, .30 caliber machine guns. He was just 19, a kid from El Paso who joined the Navy to see the world. He'd seen more action in the past 6 months than most men see in a lifetime. You ready for this, Tommy? I asked through the intercom. Born ready, sir, he replied, but I could hear the tension in his voice. We all felt it. Today it was different. Today everything was in the line. The first reports came in around 0730. Japanese planes had been spotted attacking Midway Island. That meant their carriers were launching strikes, which meant they were within our reach. But where exactly? We waited and waited. The minutes dragged by like hours. Then, at 0838, the call we'd been waiting for crackled through the radio. Enemy carriers sighted. Position 320 degrees. Distance 180 miles from Midway. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, our air group commander, didn't hesitate. All squadrons, launch immediately. We've got them. 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers rose from the deck of the Enterprise like a swarm of angry wasps. Below us, the Hornet and Yorktown were launching their own strikes. This was it. Every available plane, every pilot, every bomb we could carry, all converging on the Japanese fleet. The flight to the target took nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of flying in formation over empty ocean, burning fuel we couldn't spare, wondering if we'd find the enemy or just empty water. The Japanese were fast, and they were mobile. If they'd changed course, we might miss them entirely. But McClusky was a born hunter. When we reached the coordinates where the Japanese should have been and found nothing, he didn't panic. He didn't turn back. Instead, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast and made a calculated guess. It was heading back to the main fleet. "Follow me," McClusky radioed. "We're going to find those carriers." 15 minutes later, we did. The sight that greeted us was both terrifying and magnificent. 4 massive aircraft carriers arranged in a box formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, spread across miles of ocean like a floating city of steel and death. But something was wrong with the picture. The carriers' flight decks were crowded with aircraft. Planes were lined up wing to wing, being fueled and armed. They'd been caught in the middle of preparing for another strike. Tommy whispered through the intercom, "They're sitting ducks." At 10:22 a.m., McClusky gave the order that would change history. "Attack. Attack. All squadrons attack." I pushed my Dauntless into a steep dive, the altimeter unwinding like a broken clock. 14,000 feet. 12,000, 10,000. The carrier Kaga grew larger and larger in my bomb sight, her flight deck packed with aircraft like toys in a box. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. They'd been expecting an attack from torpedo bombers coming in low, not dive bombers screaming down from above. Their fighters were at low altitude, trying to intercept our torpedo planes. Their anti-aircraft guns were pointed in the wrong direction, but they recovered quickly. Suddenly, the sky erupted in black puffs of flak. Tracers zipped past my cockpit like deadly fireflies. The noise was incredible. The scream of my engine, the crack of exploding shells, the rattle of machine gun fire. "Stay with me, Tommy," I shouted into the intercom. "Right behind you, sir. 8,000 feet. 6,000. 4,000. The Kaga filled my entire view now. I could see sailors running across her deck, could make out the individual aircraft lined up like dominoes. My bomb was a 1,000-pound armor-piercing monster, enough to punch through the carrier's flight deck and explode in her hangar. 3,000 feet. 2,500. 2,000. I released the bomb and pulled back on the stick with everything I had. The Dauntless shuddered as we came out of the dive, the G-forces pressing me into my seat like a giant hand. Below us, the Kaga was about to die. The explosion was spectacular. My bomb hit her flight deck near the island superstructure and detonated in the hangar bay below. Instantly, the carrier was transformed into a floating inferno. Fuel lines ruptured. Aviation gasoline ignited. Armed aircraft exploded in chain reactions that lit up the morning sky. But I couldn't watch. Already, Zero fighters were climbing toward us, their guns winking as they fired. I threw the Dauntless into a screaming turn, dipping the waves to build up speed. Zero on our tail. Tommy called out, his machine guns chattering as he engaged the enemy fighter. The next few minutes were a blur of violent maneuvers, desperate turns, and the constant chatter of machine guns. Somehow, we made it through. Somehow, we survived. As we climbed back to altitude, I got my first good look at what we'd accomplished. The sight was beyond anything I'd imagined in my wildest dreams. The Kaga was a floating funeral pyre, her flight deck buckled and split, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air. But she wasn't alone. The Akagi, flagship of the Japanese striking force, was also burning. Her flight deck was a twisted ruin, her sides torn open by internal explosions. And even as I watched, the Soryu joined her sisters in destruction. Another group of dive bombers had found their mark, and Japan's third carrier was transformed into a blazing wreck in minutes. My God, Tommy breathed. We got them all. Not quite all. The Hiryu had been separated from the other three carriers and had escaped the initial attack. But her time would come. Later that afternoon, dive bombers from the Yorktown would find her and send her to the bottom along with her sisters. In the span of 6 minutes, the dive bombers of the U.S. Navy had destroyed the heart of Japanese naval aviation. 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and thousands of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew, all gone in a few moments of precision bombing. The numbers were staggering. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. We lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. It was the most decisive naval victory in American history. But the human cost was something else entirely. As we flew back toward the Enterprise, I could see oil slicks and debris fields where proud warships had been just hours before. The ocean was littered with life rafts and survivors, Japanese and American alike, all of them someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. The return flight to the Enterprise seemed to take forever. My fuel gauge was hovering near empty, and I wasn't sure we'd make it back. All around us, other Dauntless bombers were in the same predicament. We'd given everything we had to get to the target, and now we were running on fumes. "How we doing on gas, sir?" Tommy asked. "We'll make it," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure. The Enterprise was still 200 miles away, and the headwinds were stronger than forecast. But Admiral Spruance had thought of everything. As we approached the task force, the Enterprise turned into the wind and lit up like a Christmas tree. Every available light on the ship was turned on, creating a beacon that we could see from 50 miles away. One by one, the surviving aircraft of the strike force landed on the carrier's deck. Some made it with gallons to spare. Others landed with bone-dry tanks. A few didn't make it at all, ditching in the ocean near the task force where they were quickly picked up by destroyers. As my Dauntless rolled to a stop on the Enterprise's deck, I just sat there for a moment, unable to believe we'd actually done it. The most powerful naval force in the Pacific had been destroyed in a single morning. The tide of war had turned in our favor. The deck crews were already surrounding the plane, eager to hear what we'd seen. But I could barely speak. The enormity of what had happened was just beginning to sink in. "We got them," I finally managed to say. "We got them all." That evening, as the Enterprise steamed away from the battle area, I stood on the flight deck and looked out at the empty ocean. Somewhere out there, 4 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers were resting on the bottom of the Pacific, along with hundreds of their crew members. It was a victory, but victory always comes with a price. We'd lost good men too, pilots I'd trained with, flown with, shared meals with in the ready room. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his entire torpedo squadron from the Hornet. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay and most of his squadron from the Enterprise. Brave men who'd flown into the teeth of enemy fire, knowing the odds were against them, but doing their duty anyway. Tommy Rodriguez found me standing there as the sun set over the Pacific. The kid from El Paso looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. "Sir," he said quietly, "do you think this is it? Do you think we've beaten them?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "We've hurt them bad, Tommy. Real bad. But this war's not over. It's going to be a long road back to Tokyo. I was right about that. The Pacific War would drag on for 3 more years, with bloody battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But something fundamental had changed at Midway. Japan's aura of invincibility was broken. Their best pilots were dead. Their most powerful ships were on the bottom of the ocean. More importantly, we'd proven something to ourselves. We'd shown that American sailors, soldiers, and Marines could stand up to the supposedly invincible Japanese military and not just survive, but win decisively. The psychological impact of that victory was just as important as the tactical one. Looking back now, 73 years later, I realized that I was witness to one of the most decisive moments in human history. Those 6 minutes over the Kido Butai didn't just change the course of the Pacific War. They changed the course of the entire 20th century. If we'd failed at Midway, if the Japanese had succeeded in their plan to draw out and destroy the American fleet, the war in the Pacific would have lasted years longer. Australia might have fallen. India might have been invaded. The Holocaust might have continued unchecked while America struggled to hold the line in the Pacific. Instead, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, flown by ordinary Americans who'd been farmers and mechanics and college students just a few years before, turned the tide of global conflict in a few moments of extraordinary courage and skill. The Battle of Midway wasn't just about ships and planes and bombs. It was about the clash of 2 fundamentally different ways of life. On one side, you had the Japanese military machine, built on rigid hierarchy, emperor worship, and the belief that death in battle was the highest honor. On the other side, you had American democracy, with its emphasis on individual initiative, technological innovation, and the belief that every person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Midway, democracy won. Not because we had better equipment, though by 1942 we were starting to, but because we had better people. Pilots who could think for themselves, make split-second decisions, and adapt to changing circumstances. Sailors who could repair damaged equipment with spare parts and ingenuity. Leaders who trusted their subordinates to do the right thing, even when the plan went to hell. The Japanese called it the decisive battle. They were right, just not in the way they expected. Instead of dealing America a knockout blow, they received one. The 6 minutes over the Kido Butai were the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. I flew combat missions for the rest of the war, participating in the campaigns in the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and finally the assault on the Japanese home islands. I saw the American military machine grow from a peacetime force of 1.6 million to a wartime colossus of 16 million. I watched as the industrial might of America turned out ships, planes, and weapons in quantities that would have been unimaginable before the war. But I never forgot those 6 minutes over Midway. They were the moment when we stopped retreating and started advancing. The moment when we stopped reacting to Japanese moves and started making them react to ours. The moment when the hunter became the hunted. Tommy Rodriguez didn't make it home. He was killed 6 months later at Guadalcanal when our plane was shot down by a Zero fighter. He was 20 years old. I think about him every June 4th, along with all the other young men who gave their lives to turn the tide of war. The Pacific is peaceful now. Commercial airlines fly the same routes we flew in 1942, carrying tourists and businessmen instead of bombs and bullets. The coral atolls where we fought are nature preserves. The waters where Kido Butai died are busy shipping lanes. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of that long-ago battle. The wrecks of the 4 Japanese carriers rest on the ocean floor, 3 miles down, monuments to the men who died in them and the men who sent them there. Sometimes, deep-sea explorers bring up artifacts from those wrecks, a piece of armor plating, a fragment of an aircraft engine, a personal item that belonged to a sailor who died when his ship exploded beneath him. I'm 98 years old now. Most of my squadron mates are gone. Tommy Rodriguez has been dead for longer than he was alive. But I still remember every detail of that morning over Midway, the sound of the engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the sight of those 4 carriers burning on the horizon. We were just ordinary Americans, doing an extraordinary job at an extraordinary time. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We were just doing what had to be done, what our country asked us to do. But in doing it, we changed the world. The Battle of Midway lasted 4 days. The decisive phase lasted 6 minutes. But the consequences of those 6 minutes echo through history even today. Every time a democracy stands up to a dictatorship, every time free people refuse to bow to tyranny, every time ordinary citizens rise to meet an extraordinary challenge, the spirit of Midway lives on. That's what I want people to remember about that day. Not just the tactical details or the strategic implications, but the human story. The story of young Americans who flew into battle against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. The story of a democracy that refused to quit, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The story of 6 minutes that changed everything. The ocean is vast and deep, but memory is deeper still. And as long as there are Americans who remember what happened at Midway, the men who died there will not have died in vain. They died for something greater than themselves, something worth dying for. They died for the idea that free people can defend their freedom, that democracy can triumph over tyranny, that good can triumph over evil. On June 4, 1942, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers proved that idea true. It was the most important 6 minutes in the history of naval warfare. It was the moment that changed everything. And I was there. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes flew 87 combat missions during World War II and was awarded the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and 3 air medals. After the war, he returned to his hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he worked as a high school history teacher and coach. He passed away in 2021 at the age of 99, one of the last surviving participants in the Battle of Midway.